Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. Welcome to Anderson House here in Washington, D.C. My name is Andrew Outen, and I am the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory of that vast event and to preserve the timeless ideals on which this nation was established. Those ideals, such as liberty, equality, freedom, civic responsibility, natural and civil rights, and the rule of law, have shaped our nation's history as well as other countries worldwide and are just as important and relevant today as they were at the outset of the Revolutionary War in 1775. Along with this lecture tonight, the Institute's work includes supporting advanced study, developing changing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating for historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that assist teachers, students, and scholars alike. Tonight's author's talk features Dr. Jonathan Singerton of the University of Innsbruck, discussing his new book, which probably most people think there should be a question mark at the end here, The Habsburg Monarchy and the American Revolution. And this lecture or author's talk is made possible in part by a generous gift that is was provided by the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati. But before we introduce Dr. Singerton officially, I'd like to discuss a few housekeeping items for those of you tuning in with us on Zoom this evening. Following this evening's author's talk, there will be a question and answer session. So feel free to submit your questions for Dr. Singerton using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate them with the live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Mr. Mark Wheat, who is the chairman of the American Revolution Institute's History Committee, and Mark will be introducing Dr. Singerton this evening. So, Mark.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming here and being here this evening. On behalf of the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, I'd like to welcome you again to this lecture by Dr. Jonathan Singerton on the Habsburg Monarchy and the American Revolution. The American Revolution Institute supports advanced study, presents exhibitions and other public programs, advocates preservation, and provides resources to teachers and students to enrich understanding of our war for independence and the principles of the men and women who secured the liberty of the American people. The American Revolution Institute welcomes your financial support, and I can assure you that every donation is a sound investment into the future of our republic. During the American Revolution, the Habsburg monarchy, the largest continental European power of the 18th century, never formally recognized the United States, but its ruling and mercantile elites saw opportunity, especially for commerce. My own Hager, Richter, and Fischbach families left the Habsburgs' Holy Roman Empire under the reign of Charles VI and settled at Germana in Virginia in 1714. For centuries, the Habsburgs had served as Europe's anvil to the hammer blows of expansionist Islam and understood well the need for a balance of power among the great states of the West to secure its frontiers for peaceful development in the interior. In 1783, when the Society of the Cincinnati was formed, the Habsburgs only had to look back a century when Vienna nearly fell to a besieging army of the Ottoman Turks. Friendships forged at that time of our independence have continued some 250 years later, and I count the blessings of having interviewed Otto von Habsburg in his Bavarian home and the continued friendships of his daughter Walburga and his spokeswoman Eva Demerla, who has visited the society here at Anderson House. Bringing together materials from nearly 50 international archives, Dr. Singerton of the University of Innsbruck reconstructs the full sweep of relations between the nascent United States and one of the oldest European dynasties during the and after the American Revolution, and offers a re-examination of the revolution by highlighting how the American call to liberty was answered across the furthest reaches of Central and Eastern Europe. Dr. Jonathan Singleton is a lecturer and research fellow in history at the University of Innsbruck, Austria. Previously, he was a fellow at the Institute for Habsburg Studies at the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna. He received his PhD in history from the University of Edinburgh in 2018 and was awarded the university's Jeremiah Dalziel Prize in British History. He has also held numerous fellowships in the United States and Europe for his research that focuses on the global connections of Central Europe, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries. Currently at the University of Innsbruck, he teaches global and oceanic aspects of Austrian history. His first book, The Habsburg Monarchy and the American Revolution, explores the myriad responses toward the creation of the American Republic in the Habsburg monarchy. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Singleton.
Thank you very, very much for those kind words of introduction. And again, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It is a marvelous experience to be in such a splendid setting for tonight's lecture. And I'm very grateful to all of you here in the room who have come to listen to me speak tonight. And I'm grateful also to those who are tuning in online for your attendance and your attention as well. The talk I'm giving tonight is an overview and a discussion of some of my preliminary findings from my work for my book on the Habsburgs and the American Revolution. And given the setting, given the audience, and given the institution here, I think I'm safe in saying that the American Revolution was, of course, an event of great worldwide importance and of monumental historical significance. So the question is then, how do we approach such a large moment in world history? Well, I'd like to begin by looking at a small, intimate, familial event. Namely, in early 1778, a family gathered in St. Stephen's Cathedral, the main Gothic church in Vienna, to celebrate the baptism of a baby boy. The parents, Johann and Maria Schuster, were of the middling sort, typical Viennese family, and they'd come to honor their newborn child, whom they named Benjamin Silas Arthur Schuster. Now, the name Benjamin Arthur Schuster might sound strange, and it might sound familiar, and that is because Johann and Maria Schuster decided to name their child after the three American representatives in Paris: Benjamin Franklin, Silas Deane, and Arthur Lee. And indeed, they even included the three American representatives as the godparents in absentia on the birth certificate of their child, which is still recorded in the baptismal entry in the cathedral in Vienna today. A few weeks after the christening, Johann Schuster wrote to Franklin to say how they had named their child in honor of what he called the illustrious and dear people who strove for liberty half a world away. And a few years later, he wrote with the sad news of his wife's passing, but he informed Franklin that his wife, and I quote him here, took to the grave a consideration equal to mine for you and all of your comrades. And so I use this example at the beginning of the book and beginning of tonight's lecture to demonstrate the wide meaning of the American Revolution for people in the Habsburg lands. They were not people who were uninterested or disconnected from the American Revolution and its events, but they were rather people who observed it carefully, who approached it and who understood it and who were affected by it. And so in tonight's lecture, I want to make this fact simple and clear for you all to understand that the American Revolution was a monumental moment, not just in world history, but also in the history of the Habsburg monarchy and for the people living in the lands of the Habsburg monarchy. And so tonight I would like to present the talk based upon three major themes. The first of which is diplomacy, looking at the diplomatic relationships between the Habsburgs and the Americans, as first as rebels and then as a sovereign republic. and then looking at the economic ties that bound these two places, Central Europe and North America, before turning to the ideas of the revolution and its impact and legacy in the region of Central Europe. And as we go on, we will see that the American Revolution represented a diplomatic conundrum for the Habsburgs, as well as a commercial bonanza, and as well as a significant intellectual and cultural event that lasted well into the 19th century. So before we begin tonight's talk properly, and I outline the results of my book, which is available at the front as well as is detailed here on the slides, I'd like to say that doing this work involves a lot of different linguistical work, a lot of different archival work, and this is something that is not possible without the generous support of many foundations and many institutions that I've been part of over the years. So I'm very grateful to institutions like the Society of Cincinnati that continue this mission and continue funding historical research in more than just one country. It is a very noble and very necessary mission. So to begin with, I want to orientate ourselves mentally, because one of the first questions I get about my work, apart from really the Austrian Habsburgs or the American Revolution and the Habsburgs, is where is the Habsburg monarchy, or what is the Habsburg monarchy? So my first slide here tonight gives us a sense of orientation about where and what we are talking about. As you can see from the map, the Habsburg monarchy at the time of the American Revolution is somewhat similar to the Austro-Hungarian Empire that you might be familiar with from the 19th century, but with some significant additions, namely the modern day part of Belgium, here known as the Austrian Netherlands, which had been incorporated in Habsburg lands since the early 18th century, since 1714, as well as some parts of northern Italy around Milan and Mantua, and then parts of Tuscany, which were owned and ruled by the emperor's younger brother under terms of secogeniture. The Habsburg monarchy then is that monumental block and landmass of countries in Central Europe based around Austria and the duchies of Austria, as well as the Kingdom of Hungary and parts of Poland and modern-day Ukraine. It is an important country within European history, not just because of its dynasty at this time, several centuries old, but also because it is the third largest state in Europe in terms of population. 21 million people call it home. This is just behind Russia and France. And more importantly, the Habsburgs control one of the largest armies during this period as well. And in 1809, they would control the largest army in the world. Of course, as opponents and foes of Napoleon. Added to that is also the role of the Holy Roman Emperor. The Habsburgs, with a brief interlude, had headed the Holy Roman Empire, and this carried a significant diplomatic prestige and weight in the international relations in Europe. And for the Americans, this was a very important point, especially when it concerned the Hessian soldiers, which they knew and hoped to stop. And they hoped very much that the Austrians would be able to stop this, given their position as heads of the Holy Roman Empire. So this, again, is something to bear in mind when we move forward tonight and to remember as we discuss this topic. So turning to my first theme then of diplomacy. It's first important to remember that the Habsburg monarchy was a neutral power throughout the war, but it was a power that was not always assumed to be neutral. If it had gone one way or another, then the war would have turned out very differently. If, like France, the Habsburgs had decided to throw their lot in with the Americans, then the Americans may have had a greater chance to win the war sooner. If, however, the Habsburgs had decided to support the British in some way, or to involve themselves in a wider European war with Prussia over the War of Bavarian Succession, then the whole situation might have been even more dangerous for France and for Britain, and the whole situation might have escalated, much like the 7 Years' War previously. So the Habsburgs were a fulcrum in the war. They were somewhere where the British had designs upon the Habsburgs to try and turn them into a pro-British territory, and the French, as allies, tried very much to keep them neutral, or to indeed include them in their war as well. From the Americans' perspective, The Habsburgs represented one of their crucial aims in the beginning of the war. They wished to include the Habsburgs not just as potential allies, but to use them to stop the flow of Hessian mercenaries to the British ranks and to the North American theatre. So they had three main aims when it came to the Habsburgs in the early part of the war. One, to stop the flow of Hessian troops. Secondly, to secure a treaty of amity and commerce. And three, to potentially find new military supplies. For this aim, they sent this man here, William Lee, a member of the famous Lee dynasty of Virginia, and he's perhaps one of the most unfortunate diplomats you may have not heard of. He had a rather difficult time in Vienna when he was sent to persuade the Habsburgs to sign those treaties of amity and commerce, to potentially send military supplies, and to try and stop the flow of Hessian troops. However, Lee was a very ineffective diplomat, and this was partly because of his background. He was a merchant by training, and he had obtained his diplomatic position through the influence of his brother, Richard Henry Lee, in the Continental Congress. And as George Mercer, a friend of Washington, once said, neither chance nor accident could have ever named William Lee a commissioner to the first court in Europe, or indeed to any court in the world. And as Lee himself, who spoke very poor French and not a word of German, once said, it is very awkward at the age of 40 to go back to school to learn languages. So Lee was very aware of his deficiencies as a diplomat, very aware of the problems that he would face in Vienna, but nevertheless, he went in the hope of persuading the Habsburgs to join in the war on their side, or at least to support the American aims in part. Lee was supported by the French ambassador, at that time the Baron de Breteuil, who became later the last prime minister of France before the revolution. And the French supported this mission because they hoped, of course, to include the Habsburgs on their side in the war. Lee presented them that golden opportunity then to perhaps tip the scales in the balance of the war in the early period. Remember, this is 1778, so just a few years into the war itself. The only problem, however, was that Breteuil was not a very astute diplomat in handling Lee. He presented Lee at court on the very next day after Lee had made a very arduous journey from Frankfurt to Vienna. And he did this at exactly the same time as the British ambassador was presenting several English guests. So you could imagine the awkwardness of that meeting. He then repeated that the next day with the vice chancellor of the Habsburg Empire, much to the same effect. So after 2 days, Lee was effectively shut out of court, blacklisted among members. And as Maria Theresia said, do not allow this man to enter my chambers at all in any form. So Breteuil tried again a week later, trying to present Lee as a Virginian, a traveling accomplice, and this did not work either. Lee was shut out completely within a week. Now, this might sound like a failure, and diplomatically it was, but Lee caused quite a stir at the court, and anybody who could anger Maria Theresia, the empress of the Habsburg monarchy, as well as ruffle the feathers of the state chancellor, was someone that was deeply interesting to the socialites and the salonesses of Vienna. So what happened quickly was that Lee was feted by all of the Viennese. He was invited to several parties. He was dined and wined. And over several conversations, they interrogated him not only about the United States, but also about the American Revolution. And this gave rise to a greater interest in the American Revolution in Vienna, and it gave rise to a great fascination about Lee. Now, again, I mentioned earlier how he had problems speaking French. He spoke no word of German either, and this was indeed a stumbling block, but he became a cause célèbre no matter what. However, Lee was unsuccessful diplomatically. His mission lasted only a couple of weeks. And when he realized that he would not make any inroads in court, despite the successes that he'd had at these dinner parties and salons, he gave up and returned to Frankfurt before heading to Berlin, where he had a much worse time and had his papers stolen and made no diplomatic gains there either. And this is one reason why historians have labeled him as one of the most ineffective diplomats in American history, despite his advancement of the American cause in Vienna. So Lee is in a sense, one of the first diplomatic connections between these two countries. And despite his shortcomings, his mission should be acknowledged for the wider geopolitical context that it had. There was very little chance of him succeeding in any case, given the British pressure and given the poor tactics of the French. But at the same time, Lee's successes should also be acknowledged. The fact that he traveled there, the fact that he raised the American cause amongst the nobility and amongst the socialites of Vienna was a major success in the propaganda war against Britain. And indeed, during Lee's mission, the British ambassador was so despondent that he took his delegation to St. Stephen's Cathedral to pray for the British. He felt things were so bad. Turning to another diplomatic episode, this individual represents a moment now in Habsburg relations with the United States, where the Habsburgs are more interested in obtaining relations with the Americans. So whereas in the first part of the American Revolution, the early part of the American Revolution, the Habsburgs maintained neutrality, at the end of the American Revolution, where America was a new sovereign republic, the Habsburgs desired commerce. So at the end of the American Revolution in 1783, there's a great scramble to obtain commerce with America, to trade with America, to establish a commercial footing in America. And the Habsburgs were part of this great European scramble. The only problem was that they did not have a treaty at that time. They had no official diplomatic position. And so instead, they created an entirely new post in their diplomatic corps, a commercial advisor. And they sent this man, Baron Frederick Eugene de Balen-Bertolf, a civil servant from Brussels who had worked in the administration in the Austrian Netherlands, a person who spoke good English, a very diligent clerk, and someone who would go to America to start the groundwork for later diplomatic relations, and someone who would prepare the opportunities that lay ahead commercially. Balen was sent over to Philadelphia in 1783. He traveled on the frigate George Washington with Henry Lawrence, for example, and he arrived with his family and got to work almost immediately. Again, his main mission was to support the merchants that had traded with America during the war and to scout out new possibilities for Habsburg trade in North America. Balen did his job very well indeed. He wrote a total of 350 reports, and if you go to the archives in Vienna, you'll find these reports still kept in their original boxes, and they measure about this high. So it's a huge amount of paperwork that he created, all of them written by hand, and in total is around 1,600 pages. So this man was really the Habsburg eyes and ears on the ground between 1783 and 1789. He also traveled extensively around the United States at this time. He traveled to meet people as part of Congress. He traveled to meet financiers. He knew many of the Cincinnati that had founded this society. And he ingratiated himself very well into American society as a foreign dignitary. And this is also evident in the sketches left behind by his son, Constantine. This is one of the sketches possibly drawn from a portrait rather than life, done by his son and kept in the family's sketchbook. So indeed, he knew people like Washington, he knew people like Robert Morris, the Lee family, and so on. Balen also is interesting because he not only represented the Habsburg interest in America post-war, but also the rising interest that the Habsburg had in Native Americans. Balen himself was very intrigued by the situation of Native Americans in the 1780s. And he felt, compared to the United States, which at the time was going through many political difficulties and a great deal of turbulence economically in the 1780s, that the Native Americans offered perhaps a new way forward. He had multiple plans, which he wrote in several reports to his superiors in Brussels and in Vienna, where they would trade directly with Native American nations, and particularly the Oneida Nation in upper state New York. And it was for that reason that he traveled then to New York in 1785, when he learned that the Oneida were there visiting to discuss treaties with the United States. And so he traveled to meet Native American delegates to try and open up trade with them. And in his reports, you find things like this, like portraits of King of the Seminoles, where he describes the situation of Native Americans in very positive terms. And indeed, in this portrait, one that he sent to his superiors in Vienna, he discussed how their structure of governments is very similar to the Holy Roman Empire, and in many ways how the Seminoles and their titles for their king were similar to the hereditary titles for the Austrian Habsburgs. So Bailyn also represents that wider interest that the Habsburgs had, not just in North America and in the United States, but also in Native America as well. Bailyn's reports, it goes without saying, were read quite widely. There was a rather large distribution network, so he sent these directly to Brussels, where he was under the purview of a special council set up to deal with North American trade. And then from there, it was sent to Vienna to the state chancellor, shared among the imperial family, and then was distributed through the various chancelleries as well to many local regional governments and merchants. And this brings me on to then my second theme, which is commerce and the role of commerce in shaping the Habsburgs' response to the American Revolution. In dealing with commerce, I'm going to look specifically at two sites within the Habsburg monarchy. The first of which is the port city of Ostend. And again, to orientate ourselves spatially, Ostend lies within what is nowadays Belgium, but then was part of the Austrian Netherlands, and it's here upon the coast of the North Sea. Now, the important thing to know about Ostend is it is in a rather fortunate position at the time of the American Revolution. You see, Antwerp was, for many centuries before the American Revolution, one of the leading trade ports in Europe. And this had come to a stuttering halt following the closure of the main river, the Scheldt River, that had fueled its trade and allowed Antwerp to grow so big. And when this was closed by the Dutch as part of their plan to reorientate commerce up to Amsterdam, Antwerp declined. And so did most of the trade and commerce in the Austrian Netherlands. However, to overcome this, Habsburg ministers, after they'd taken over the Austrian Netherlands in 1714, began a series of canal works to reorientate the trade away from this north-south axis and instead to move it to the shoreline around Ostend, Bruges, and Newport. And so at the time of the American Revolution, there was this extensive canal network that allowed trade from the Holy Roman Empire, from the industrial heartland of the Austrian Netherlands to the sea and to ports like Ostend. Now, why is this important? Well, because of this small slither of land, which is not part of the Habsburg monarchy, but rather its own independent nation, the Prince Bishopric of Liège. Now, I see many faces in the audience that wonder, why am I mentioning the Prince Bishopric of Liège? Well, this is because the Prince Bishopric of Liège was one of the major manufactories for weapons in Europe in the late 18th century. 240,000 guns were produced per annum in Liège. And so when you were fighting a war against what is effectively one of the greatest superpowers of the day, you need weapons to fight this. And so the American revolutionaries very early on in the war realized that they could get weapons from Liège and transport them rather easily to ports like Newport and Ostend, and then over to the colonies. And so Liège becomes this sort of export hub for not only the American revolutionaries, but then for many other belligerent nations in the war, for France, for Britain, for the Dutch as well. The only problem is that as France enters the war in 1778, the southern route from Liège along the Sable River is closed. When the Dutch enter the war in 1780, then the northern route is also closed. And that means that only the canal route to the sea via Ostend is really open. And so what happens is that the trade from Liège in weaponry goes through to Ostend and explodes. Ostend, between 1776 and 1783, ships over £2 million worth of munitions in that period. And just to give you some context, in 1780, Ostend had averaged around 480 ships per year in its harbour. Between 1780, once the northern route and the southern routes were both closed, around 3,000 ships entered Ostend. So this was an enormous explosion of trade in that tiny harbor, so much so that they pulled down part of the wall to build a new district for the city. And of course, all of this meant that the Habsburg economy and the local coffers in Brussels, and then by extension in Vienna, had swollen massively from the trade in weaponry and so on. So Ostend became, again, this major hub of weapons trade in the Habsburg monarchy. It is the only neutral port, effectively, in the North Sea during the American Revolution. And it gives rise to not only trade in weapons, but also neutral trade in general. Because if you are a British ship, you will be attacked by a French ship. And if you're a French ship, you will be attacked by a British ship. So the way that merchants avoided this was to use the neutral Habsburg naval flag, which meant that they could not be attacked as they were part of a neutral maritime fleet. And so firms, French firms, Dutch firms, British firms, used Ostend as their hub, as a subsidiary place, to mask their ships by using the Habsburg flag, by registering their companies in Ostend, and then using that flag and their neutral vessels to support their economies and their colonies. So, for example, Ostend becomes the lifeline for many planters in the Antilles and in the Caribbean. And without Ostend, many of those colonies would have suffered even more, with food shortages, with material shortages, and so on. And indeed, the legal fallout from this created such havoc that the Habsburgs had to create a consular position in London in 1782 just to deal with the caseload of claims and legal battles over this neutral trade in Ostend. It was a continual headache for them. And even the neutral trade in Ostend gave rise to its own verb at the time, ostendisieren, to ostendize your ship, to neutralize your ship as well. So this was then one of the reasons why, after the war, Bailyn was sent to protect this trade that had grown up, to protect the infancy that had arisen in Ostend, and try and continue this trade to North America, to the Caribbean in particular. But it was not just in Ostend that this trade had grown up. And this is where I then turn our attention to another port in the Habsburg monarchy, namely the port of Trieste in the Adriatic opposite Venice. And Trieste, at the beginning of the 18th century, was a rather small village, a rather small port, a rather regional one. But over time, it became the focus of a new commercial experimentalism in the Habsburg lands. And this is exemplified perhaps by this fresco that, if you go to the National Library in Austria, you'll see adorning one of the ceilings. And it's part of this great plan by Charles VI to turn what he sees as these port cities of Trieste and Fiume into the new Seville, or the new Cadiz of Central Europe. And he makes them free ports, models of Spanish trading. And so by the time of the American Revolution, then Trieste had grown up somewhat into a wider international trading hub. And people in the port of Trieste were very aware of the American Revolution and its effect on commerce, because after all, the 13 colonies declared in the Declaration of Independence that they were free to make trade with the rest of the world and were no longer part of the British Empire and its monopoly on their trade. And so already in 1776, about a month after the Declaration of Independence, you have one observer in Trieste who writes to the finance ministry in Vienna and says that the current situation of the English colonies in America seems to merit considerable attention, and more than ever before to have commerce, which has especially made the Dutch and English so rich and respectable. So already in 1776, there were those in Trieste who had paid attention to what was happening in the American colonies and wanted to start direct trade. Now, this doesn't occur instantly. It takes a Flemish merchant who had moved to Trieste, his name is Ignaz van Porten, to start the first direct trade from Trieste to North America. And this begins in 1782 with the very first ship called L'Americano, a very imaginative name, to go and trade directly with the Carolinas and the Caribbean. This trade proves rather profitable. Van Porten sends 2 further ships in November of 1782, And this begins then the great race and the great scramble among Trieste merchants in 1783, again, at the same time that Balen is going over to America, at the same time that Europeans are jostling to become the major trading partners with the United States. And this begins this great race in Trieste to obtain a share of that American commerce. In 1783 itself, the direct trade between North America and Trieste amounts to around 100,000 florins in worth, which might not sound a lot, but it is quite a substantial income for a company. And already out of the 20 ports that Trieste traded with, America ranked number 12. And again, this might not sound rather high, but Trieste at that time was still a very provincial port. Only 5% of its trade went out of the Mediterranean, but among that 5%, America was already the most profitable trading route. So the Triestine merchants knew that they were on a successful venture, and they knew the promise of American commerce was proving true. Now, I often get asked when I discuss Habsburg trade and North America is, what did they trade? What were they interested in trading? Well, thanks to a trading table for 1783 that I discovered in the course of my research, I can tell you exactly what they traded and exactly how much they traded based on those initial voyages. And if you see from this table, and if you can't read it, you can read it in the book itself, the main produce that they traded were Bohemian linens, around 33%, followed by Bohemian glass and crystal. So these Bohemian products were rather important then for American markets and rather important for Habsburg traders. And there's a good reason for this in some senses, because the Habsburg policy at that time was to try and get things like Bohemian glassware and Bohemian linens to go south via Trieste as the main port, rather than to go north via Hamburg, where it was more expensive based upon tolls and distance and so on like this. So this was part of that as well. The other part, as you can see, were mainly metal goods, because they had a lot of need for this in the American colonies and the American states at the time. And so the traders traded mainly in Styrian iron, as well as Oriental goods such as spices and foreign woods and so on like this. So they took most of these products over to the United States. They came back with traditional sort of American products such as tobacco, indigo, and so on, and sugar, which were, of course, in high demand in the Habsburg monarchy. Now, the reason why trade never quite develops between the United States and Habsburg monarchy after 1787, or after this brief post-war period, is really down to the man on the left, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson at that time was one of two ambassadors, American ambassadors in Europe, alongside John Adams in London, who were responsible for negotiating treaties of commerce and new relationships with other European powers. And indeed, they did so. They signed treaties with Sweden, with Prussia, with Morocco, and places like that, but not with the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs, as Mark pointed out in his introduction, were really among the last great European powers to fully recognize the United States and have any official connection to the United States. And the reason, in a certain sense, is because these negotiations failed on Jefferson's watch. And they failed on Jefferson's watch because he wished to avoid a treaty with the Habsburgs. He wished to avoid an official connection with them. And he did so for two reasons. The first was that he disbelieved in the idea that commerce with the Habsburgs would really mean much at all. He had not spent time in the Habsburg lands in the Austrian Netherlands, such as John Adams, and Adams, who had been in Brussels and he had been in Bruges, and he had seen for himself the great economic activity there, believed fully that the Habsburgs were a very important commercial partner for the future. The same goes for Adams's conversations with the Habsburg ambassador in France. They spent many times in conversation talking about these future plans. Jefferson, by contrast, did not. He did not share the same circles. He did not discuss these at length. And so there's a second reason as well why Jefferson avoids the Habsburgs, and that's partly because of his view of the man on the left, on the right, which is the Emperor Joseph II. And Jefferson has a very negative view of Joseph in the mid-1780s. Again, unlike Adams, who heralded him as one of the greatest men of the age. Jefferson saw Joseph as a meddling sort of maverick leader, someone who had almost gone to war with the Dutch over the Scheldt River question in the Austrian Netherlands, who tried to trade away the Austrian Netherlands for Bavaria, and who was now starting a war with the Turks. So Jefferson had a very different view of Joseph II during this period, and for that reason he tried to avoid a trade deal. And indeed, 100 days before he died, he replied to a letter from John Quincy Adams asking him why there was no sort of deal with the Austrians. And he said, "Austria became desirous of a treaty with us, and her ambassador pressed it often upon me, but our commerce with her being no object, I evaded these repeated invitations." And indeed, Jefferson stalled. He lied about the powers of his commission. He went on tours when the ambassador tried to call upon him, and he simply ran out the clock until it was too late to negotiate a deal. And without this deal, there could then be no effective competition. So the Habsburg merchants couldn't trade competitively with the rest of Europe, because by the late 1780s, most of the European nations, Spain, Portugal, even, like I said, Sweden, had trade deals with America, and they simply could not compete with these foreign merchants. There's a sense of irony in this story as well, because when Jefferson returns to America, becomes Secretary of State, and then later finishes his term as Secretary of State, or finishes early, he embarks upon the great building project of Monticello to build his house, design his house, and so on. And as part of this, he uses glass from Bohemia. So Bohemia, of course, had very good quality glass. And if you see Monticello and you ever go to the dome room in Monticello, the original cupola was Bohemian glass, because it was the only glass strong enough for the cupola at that time. And so Jefferson, in the late 1790s, early 1800s, orders around 1,600 panes of Bohemian glass to finish Monticello, and incidentally recommends a Bohemian merchant, who was also sent by ministers in Vienna, a friend of Mozart's and the same Freemason club as Mozart. He uses this merchant for this glass and recommends this merchant to others. And the White House, before the British came back in 1812 to, I won't mention what they did, but before the events of 1812, let's say, the original panes in the White House were also Bohemian glass, and the same in the Capitol building as well. So all of that cost a lot more because of Jefferson's aversion to the Habsburgs, because the glass had to go northwards to Hamburg rather than southwards to Trieste. So in some sense, because of Jefferson's actions, he paid it through the nose when buying this glass. So I'll turn now to the final theme for tonight, and my sort of major interest in this topic, namely the intellectual spectacle of the American Revolution, the ideas of liberty, the ideas of the American Revolution, and how these permeated in the Habsburg lands. And my main point here is to say that the Habsburgs, like with commerce, like with diplomacy, they were not disconnected and uninterested people, but rather they were very astute, very engaged participants in the American Revolution in this sense. And as one of the great Hungarian writers and poets later said, "What be our gatherings in villages until now, than mere discussion of which hound is more worthy, the tan or the black? And what number among us knew whether the Atlantic Ocean lies east or west of us?" He referred, of course, to the immense impact of the American Revolution for the everyday person in the Habsburg monarchy, the reorientation of their horizons, their mental horizons, and their broadening of their horizons based upon the ideas of liberty, of just fighting, and of the American cause. And one of the most useful barometers to gauge then this intellectual awareness of the American Revolution in the Habsburg lands is the figure of Benjamin Franklin, and more specifically, the mail that Franklin received. So in total, Franklin received over 250 letters from almost 100 individuals in the Habsburg lands. And you can see on the map, the small diagram on the left here, that this covers really the breadth of all of those Habsburg lands that I pointed out in the first map. So from pretty much all the corners of the Central European areas, as well as the northern Italian possessions, as well as Tuscany, and of course, a great mercantile, merchant interest in the Austrian Netherlands. So Franklin received a great amount of letters and great amount of mail from Habsburg correspondence between 1776 and 1789. Now, again, these two, the chart below that counts that, as well as the diagram above that shows that, might not look that much, but it is one of the most impressive sort of connections to Franklin from the German-speaking lands. Compared to, say, a comparable kingdom such as Prussia, this is a ratio of 5 letters to 1. So it's a very significant interest in the American Revolution based upon the letters that Franklin received. And these letters, by and large, express quite a lot of sympathy. And this might be understandable because people want to flatter Franklin, they want to gain his attention and so on. But if we read these letters, you really see the utter conviction that some of these people had. For example, there were 2 cavalry officers on the lower border of Hungary and Mohács. So they're represented by this dot here. And they write to Franklin that we are born in the empire where we still breathe some freedom, but we are burning with desire to spend our days in a country where freedom will make so many happy. And like many of them, they wrote to Franklin not only to offer their services, but also to congratulate him, to offer their applause and their salutations for his victories and for his American cause. And this comes from all social strata in the Habsburg monarchy, from members of the Habsburg government to even a school teacher in Lower Austria who writes with a new gunpowder recipe that he thinks will win the Americans the war. And even members of Maria Theresia's own circle write letters to Franklin saying how moved they are by the American cause. And as a further example, one of these letters came from a gentleman called Joseph Kaufmann, who was the first American-born student at the University of Vienna. He was born in Philadelphia in 1755. He had studied in the Austrian Netherlands at St. Omer's College near Brussels before he went to Vienna to study medicine, Vienna being one of the main Catholic universities at that time. And Kaufmann was an exceptionally bright student. He finished his studies early, a feat quite remarkable for its time. And as he wrote to Franklin, he was debating with himself at the tender age of 23 about what to do in his life. He had the whole world open to him. He wanted originally to study further in Edinburgh, or to join several doctors in London, or to even go to Philadelphia. But he decided, and this is what he wrote to Franklin, that I shall think it is the first duty of man to serve his country. And touched by the present calamities, he wished to go and fight in what he called was one of the most glorious causes in the history of the world. And so Kaufmann gathered together a band of Viennese brothers, several of his fellow students and friends from Vienna, and they went to go and fight in the American Revolution. And sadly, we don't know what happened to all of them, but in Kaufmann's case, he died aboard the USS Randolph when it was sunk by a British warship in mid-Atlantic. So he did indeed fulfill his dream to try and do something for the American cause. So this is, again, one example of how people were intimately moved by the American Revolution in the Habsburg monarchy. Now, at court, we have one man above all to thank for the spreading of American sympathy and spreading of the American cause. And this is the bust of the man on the left, Jan Eginhous, a Dutch-born physician who had spent many years in London. He is perhaps most notable and most famous today as the discoverer of the process of photosynthesis. But Eginhous at this time had come to Vienna to inoculate the imperial family against smallpox and then stayed there among the literati of the court. Eginhous knew Franklin very well. They were good friends from their time in London, and they kept a lively correspondence throughout their life. And Franklin knew this, and Franklin knew how close he was with not only the courtiers, but also with the Empress Maria Theresa. And so he used Egan House really as a conduit to the imperial family. And Egan House was more than happy to play along with this. He wrote essays defending Franklin early on in the war. This is one of them you see here on the right. He translated his letters and translated his works and delivered them personally to Maria Theresa and her courtiers as well. So Egan House was, in a sense, this hub of American knowledge right at the center of the court in Vienna. And Franklin had this direct hotline, in a sense, to the imperial family and the Habsburg family, which he had nowhere else in Europe. Even in France, he had to request an audience or be asked to go and see the king. He had no direct communication line such as he did in Vienna. And indeed, this comes from the imperial family's interest, perhaps then, in the American Revolution. Maria Theresa read these essays by Egan House. She read the letters written by Franklin with great interest. She corresponded with Marie Antoinette in France in minute detail about the outcome of the war and about the possibilities in the war. She was very engaged about it, but she was not alone. Her son, Joseph II, who later became the sole ruler and emperor in his own right, was one of the most fascinated by the American Revolution. He found it at times a pain and a diplomatic problem, but in other times he found it a very noble cause. And this is best exemplified by his mission in late 1777 to go and see his sister Marie Antoinette, ostensibly to ask her why she had not produced an heir to the French throne. But during that visit, he drew up a list of notable intellectuals that he wished to meet and to correspond with. And among that list was Benjamin Franklin, of course, who was there as the ambassador and representative. Now, Joseph couldn't go and knock on the door of Franklin. Instead, there was a meeting arranged through the Tuscan delegation in Paris for the two of them to meet over hot chocolate. Now, the meeting doesn't take place, sadly. Franklin turns up, he waits an hour, he expects Joseph to arrive, he doesn't, and then after an hour he leaves. And he notes this on the invitation letter itself. And then after about 2 hours or so, Joseph turns up and doesn't see Franklin there, and again takes his leave as well. So the meeting doesn't happen because they just miss each other. Now, when I found that out, I wondered why that was the case. I wondered what had caused this great meeting to fail between two great minds of the age of the Enlightenment. And indeed, who is to blame, as is often to blame in history? The British. The British knew that Joseph wanted to meet Franklin that day, and they sent a small visiting party to descend upon him and effectively stalled him so that he couldn't go and see Franklin. And again, this is because of the great stakes at play, because they did not want Franklin to be seen to be entertained and met with the Holy Roman Emperor, because that would be a great win for America. So it's dirty politics as usual. In the same vein, Joseph's younger brother, Leopold, at that time more known as Pietro Leopoldo, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Remember, he rules Tuscany in his own right. He would later succeed his brother as the emperor in 1790. So again, he's a very important figure in the Habsburg monarchy. He begins around this time a constitutional project in Tuscany. He wants to enshrine rights for Tuscans. He wants to improve the government. And for one of those considerations, he looks at the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776, among others. And it's quite remarkable to see, and you see it here on the left, his handwritten notes on the Pennsylvania Constitution, and to see at the very beginning that he writes, and this is the quote you can read on the screen: "What I ask is that in order to make a good legal code in all states, even in monarchies, one must begin with the principle posed by the Americans, the principle of equality." So Leopold, who was often regarded as one of the most enlightened rulers of that time, drew direct inspiration from the American constitutions, such as Pennsylvania Constitution, and from the American cause in general. He even had American propaganda translations, French translations of Franklin's works and so on, delivered to the Hofburg in Vienna later in life as well. So he was very intimately interested in the American Revolution. And it goes to show as well that you could be a monarchist at this time and still agree with the principles of the American Revolution, could still agree in just causes and in liberty and freedom and so on. Those things were at that time still compatible before the French Revolution. And in a similar vein, this is the case with another person who will be unfamiliar to many, namely Johann Zinner. Now, Johann Zinner is in all intents and purposes one of the earliest historians of the American Revolution. He is a Bohemian-born German speaker who was active in Eastern Hungary, where he wrote many of the earliest histories about the American Revolution and the early United States. And in 1777, he was observing from his earlier job at the Royal Academy in Budapest, what was going on in North America. And he followed this quite intensely based upon the news reports and the newspaper reports that he read, but he had a lot of problems in discerning what was fact and what was fiction, because some newspapers would contradict each other, some reports would detail different things. And so he wrote to Franklin with a bit of exaggeration that sometimes Benedict Arnold is made out to be a German of Mainz, sometimes he is an American of Connecticut, and sometimes he is a Latz Capuchin monk, and sometimes he is a Norwegian shopkeeper. How was he to know who the true Benedict Arnold was, for example? So Zinner posed this question to Franklin, and Franklin invited him to come to Paris, where he would share actual material with him. And this, again, for Zinner was very important, as he was a trained historian and later a professor of universal history. So Zinner traveled with happy glee to visit Franklin to gather these materials and then to set upon writing the first histories of the American Revolution. And you see here in 1782 the results of his first works. This book in German, Merkwürdige Briefe und Schriften der berühmtesten Generäle in America, remarkable or noteworthy letters and writings of the most famous generals in America. Many of the Cincinnati feature their writings in this. This was a compendium of what he believed to be true original letters and writings of these people. Again, it's a sort of primary source edition by an historian. And he wrote this because he believed in the American cause. And he wrote to Franklin after he'd published this work to say that he was working on 2 further books. And these books were believed by Hungarian scholars to be lost irrevocably because they were never published, but they were simply in the archives in Slovakia. So you see the 2 works here. The first one written in Latin, the Notitia Historica de Coloniis America, historical notes on colonial America. And then the second one, a attempt at a war history of the United States of America. Both of these works are immense works, handwritten volumes. The first one on the left is around 200 pages and details the history of America from Columbus to the Peace of Paris. And the second one, a more rounded version written in his native German language, is around 550 pages. And again, these are handwritten pages. So if they were published, they might be even longer. And again, they detail the entirety of American history up to 1784. So this is then the obvious question: why did Zinner feel the need to compose these works in Eastern Hungary at that time? Well, he wrote to Franklin on 2 occasions, which best describe his motivation for this. And I'm going to read both quotes out, and you can follow along with me. And in the first one, he writes, "I was born the subject of a great monarch and under a government whose rule is mild. But I cannot tell you what joy I feel when I hear or read of your progress in America. To speak the truth, I look upon you and all the chiefs of your new republic as angels sent by heaven to guide and comfort the human race. And to give public manifestation of this sentiment, I am composing this work." And then later in 1783, as he had finished his handwritten volumes, he wrote again, and with a small dedication to the American Congress. And he writes, "The people of America happily built the Capitol in only 7 years and founded a new and prosperous republic, which is your glory in the New World. This is what amazes all peoples, and even the faraway peoples," perhaps referring to those around him in the House of Monarchy. "This is what moves me most, that I pass on your young origin, your tireless work for freedom, and the memory that I record the outstanding public announcement of your fame with writings. Onwards, you most excellent men, your name as an example of my fully devoted vigilance. Follow the counsel of the just and the good, and you will be held by me with the most glorious praise for those who seek renewal." So it's very clear in these admissions and these writings to Franklin that Zinner wrote these works because he felt part of the American Revolution. He felt moved by its events, and he felt that he had to act and to give it a legacy in print. This legacy, as I point out in the epilogue of my book, was long lasting. So it was not just Zinner and all the examples I've mentioned now in the 1770s and 1780s, but this extends beyond into the 19th century. In the 1848 revolutions, people who were demonstrating in Milan or in Budapest looked to America as the main example. Kossuth, the great Hungarian leader, was known as Washington of Hungary, for example. So this is a continual legacy in the Habsburg lands, despite the rise of conservatism in the 1790s and 1800s. And really, it is the French Revolution that changes that legacy irrevocably. So as we've seen up to now, the Habsburg monarchy is a rather open space, a space where courtiers, where officials, where merchants, where historians, where people of all kinds could celebrate and support the American cause. But after the French Revolution, the support of the American Revolution and such causes becomes an unacceptable cause. And so people are dissuaded from this, they are pushed away from this. And one of the main turning points in this is the 1795 so-called Jacobin conspiracy. So Hungarians who were believed by ministers in Vienna to plot to overthrow the government, who had been inspired by French revolutionaries and by American revolutionaries as well. And so they were executed quite brutally, as you can see here, in 1795. And so from that point onwards, there's an irrevocable shift in the Habsburg lands towards a more narrow, so closed world, one which looks away from the American Revolution and finds it intolerable. But again, it cannot snuff out what I think of as the residue of resolution. And so people are still looking towards the American example, albeit in much smaller numbers and in much more radical ways. And so I leave with this quote then by one of the great Hungarian poets, written in that year, 1795, where he writes, I, an exile in my own country, carry on my days in boredom. I am happy only when I can find a new world for myself and build a republic, a Philadelphia, and at least there, like Franklin, I can snatch lightning from heaven and the scepters from tyrants. And so to finish and to offer some summary of what I've discussed so far, the American Revolution existed well beyond the 13 colonies and impacted places like the Habsburg monarchy in more than one way. It was a cultural phenomenon which the revolution imparted new ideas and served as a new model as well as a spectacle for onlookers. And before the French Revolution, people could support a monarchy, but also be sympathetic and enthralled by the American Revolution and the republic which it stood for. And as a commercial opportunity, the revolution represented a disturbance to the status quo that brokered new connections and contacts between Central Europe and North America, which had helped realize the long-standing colonial dreams of the Austrian Habsburgs. And without the trade of the Austrian Netherlands and Ostend and the Prince Bishopric of Liège, all the belligerents would have had a much more difficult time in securing their weaponry to continue the fight of the American Revolution. And then finally, as a diplomatic moment, the Habsburg monarchy was one of the fulcrums of the war, which the American Revolution turned around. And American revolutionaries were aware of its importance in a way that we have sadly forgotten today, in which I hope you've all remembered and will remember from tonight and from my work. So thank you very much for your attention and time. I believe we have a question and answer round also for people online, so I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Right at the front, yeah. I think there's a microphone coming. Oh, sorry, there's a question at the back first.
My question has to do with the Hessian soldiers and the influence of the Austrians on staunching the flow of Hessian soldiers to North America.
What's your question exactly? Sorry.
How would the Austrians have been able to influence the stopping the flow of Hessian soldiers to North America?
Okay, thank you. Do you want to collect a few, or should I? Okay, so it's a good question. How did they hope to stop the flow of Hessians, or how did Americans believe they had the influence to do this? Again, as I mentioned, the Habsburgs were the heads of the Holy Roman Empire, and Americans had that belief that as the head of the Holy Roman Empire, they could effectively order the German princes to stop the trade and to stop selling them essentially to the British. This was not quite correct. They did not have that power. They hoped that in the lands where the emperor did have direct control, that he could effectively shut the border to those areas. And so this would either make it impossible for the Hessians to travel to the coast and travel to the route to Hanover and to Britain, or it would make it a lot more difficult and costly, and perhaps even deter them from this trade if it was too great a distance to travel around. So they hoped that either he could order it directly by instructing the princes to stop, or that he could make it difficult by closing certain internal borders within the Holy Roman Empire. Now, it again is not really that feasible. That was what they understood as a possibility. That's what they hoped. But Joseph had no real interest in ever doing this. And again, he did not want to upset the status quo with the British especially. So Joseph was not very amenable to these ideas to begin with. There were concerns in the Habsburg monarchy, and this is perhaps the direct relation to the Hessians, were that the Hessian regiments had been sapping the Habsburg army. There had been people who had left the Habsburg army and left Austrian service to go join the Hessians simply because they could make more money, or because they were recruited or even kidnapped by recruiters to join the Hessian service. They were pressed into it, especially in the further Austrian territories, so the territories bordering these areas in southern Germany. And so the War Ministry, for example, in Vienna, were very upset about this and tried to stop that by cracking down on what they saw as advertisements for the Hessians, literature to do with the Hessians, and texts about adventures or about military escapades, even texts about Robinson Crusoe, for example, were then banned in the Habsburg monarchy to stop people even having ideas like going to fight in a foreign war or to have a great adventure abroad because of that. So I hope that answers your questions. You're welcome.
You mentioned Ostend and Trieste. What were the major ports in this country that they were shipping to?
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. So at the beginning, I said the trade from Trieste focuses on the Carolinas, mainly for the typical sort of plantation goods such as sugar, indigo, and so on, tobacco as well. But the major trade in the 1780s rests mainly upon Philadelphia. That's where a lot of then the trade would be taken to and offloaded as a sort of major hub. And so you see in Philadelphia newspapers that there will be goods such as Ottoman spices that have just come in from Trieste and are sold by the nephew of Benjamin Franklin, for example. So Philadelphia becomes a major sort of hub for the trade. But gradually, over time in the early 1780s, all of the ports become targets. So Charleston is a particular port of interest for people in Ostend, mainly due to the contacts and the connections they have, particular family relations or particular contacts that they knew. William Lee, who I mentioned as that diplomat, he engaged with a Ostend merchant trade to Virginia, to Norfolk, for example. New York was also a port that was visited quite often. So it's a rather broad range. It wasn't just sort of one major one, but if there was a focus at one particular time or another, Philadelphia was pretty constant throughout that, but many ports.
Thank you. That was a great talk.
Thank
Jack Inman, Department of State. I wanted to ask you to talk about a couple of things, if you would. One, when you grow up in the U.S., it's like you're growing up inside the Roman Empire and you don't have an awareness as much, of the world. But when you go to Europe, you realize that the American Revolution, actually right through the Civil War, the whole experiment had a huge numbers of people in Europe were fascinated by what was happening here. And also the Habsburgs. I mean,
Mm,
not only were they fascinated, but their impact, we're not taught about how great their impact was. I mean, their impact was not worldwide, it was Central and Eastern Europe, but it was as powerful there as Britain and Spain and France, maybe not quite as Britain, but I was wondering what you would have to say about, there was my wife's the Washington Bureau Chief called Radio Romania. We spent a lot of time in Transylvania. And there was we were in Alba Carolina, which is a great fortress.
mm,
It's also great art. I mean, it reminds you of being in Rome or someplace where there's powerful fortress, but it's also got statuary and all kinds of stuff. There was a peasant uprising apparently in the 1780s.
Koreas,
I'd
yeah.
like to hear more about the 1790s one you were talking about. And was it Joseph was emperor then, I guess. He came and talked to them and parlayed with them, then he hung them, but there was a widespread peasant uprising. And also, can you talk about that and a
Mhm.
little more about what you said about the 1790s? And also, what do you think of the Congress of Nations, Franz Joseph's idea?
Great. That's really interesting question. Thank you for these fascinating points. The rebellion that you mentioned that took place in Transylvania is commonly known as Horia, I believe I pronounced that correctly, Horia's rebellion, named after one of the three sort of peasant leaders of this. And it has its roots in sort of ethnic tensions. Transylvania is an area with German settlement, with Zelka Germans, with Hungarians, and with Ruthenians or Romanians there as well. So three main groups that at this point in the late 1780s don't quite get along. And there's an uprising then of the sort of ethnic Romanian population. The interesting connection then to the American Revolution is that when they make a declaration of their aims and their independence from the monarchy, they make quite overt allusions to the American Declaration and to the rights of man, these kinds of things. You can put that down to sort of the general Enlightenment times rather than any direct knowledge of the American Revolution, I would say. What's interesting about this rebellion is that onlookers in Europe were particularly aware of its parallels to the American Revolution. And Brissot, Pierre Brissot, a great French radical in France at that time, writes letters, public letters that are published and widely circulated, admonishing Joseph for this, for essentially saying, you are the new King George. You have let this happen. You have created the conditions just as they were in America. And he's the one that really draws then the greatest sort of parallels between this Transylvanian rebellion and the rebellion in the 13 colonies. Again, it's a interesting episode and interesting issue to discuss, but it's not one that I would fully subscribe to. But it is something that is discussed at that time, and it's something I mentioned in the epilogue of the book as well. And that's also then part of, as you pointed out, the wider sort of 1790s. The great ferment of the French Revolution had really broken out. And I think that it's important to remember again that in the period of the main focus of my book, the 1770s and 1780s, the American Revolution is not a dirty word. The American Revolution is a noble cause. It is a cause about rights and liberty and so on like this. And it is something that all people could support in sort of all countries. And then after 1789, it becomes swept up in a more radicalized sense, especially after the French Terror has begun. And so the American Revolution is really twisted and turned around in the period of the 1790s, but it is still very potent as a memory, as a cultural phenomenon. And in the Habsburg lands, especially in the Austrian Netherlands, the American Revolution is looked at as a major model alongside the emerging French Revolution, especially when you have the United States of Belgium, the sort of independence wars in the early 1790s in the Austrian Netherlands. And then to come to things like the Congress of Nations, I mentioned this also in the epilogue, looking forward towards the 19th century, in the late 19th century. There are several points in Habsburg history where there are people calling for a federated monarchy to solve the great issues of nationalism and of rights for ethnic groups in the monarchy. And throughout that, America is still seen as one of the models. It is upheld on more than one occasion as a great opportunity for the Habsburg monarchy, or for Austria-Hungary at that time, to remodel itself based on a federate American system. That never occurs, never kind of comes through. But it's a testament, as I see it, and its relevance here to this story, of that enduring effect of what I again call as the residue of the revolution in Central Europe and in the Habsburg lands. So I hope that touches upon all of your questions. I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards if you want more detail. But thank you for great points.
All right, we do have a few questions from Zoom, if you wouldn't mind. One question is, knowing you talked about the extensive arms trade that was going on earlier on in the presentation, knowing that was going on, did the British put any measures into their overall strategy to try to stop that, or did the French do that?
Did the British try and stop the arms trade?
Yeah, specifically the British is what the question is.
Yes, so the British, with regards to the arms trade, is quite interesting in the case of Tuscany. So as I mentioned at the outset, Tuscany is, I see it as part of this story of the Habsburgs and the revolution. You can't sort of separate them. One of the main reasons why Lee goes to Vienna is because the Americans misinterpret Tuscan actions and believe that the dynasty as a whole is friendly towards them. And so I include it in the book quite extensively. In this case, and the reason why I bring up Tuscany is that the British are quite quite bossy towards the Tuscans in a sense, and especially to the brother's emperor, the emperor's brother, in pushing through a neutrality in Tuscany. They do not want Tuscany to trade with Americans because, if you all remember the name Filippo Mazzei, a great sort of patriot of Tuscany who had brokered contacts between America and Tuscany on the eve of the revolution. He was instrumental, along with many other merchants in Livorno, in supplying the Americans with goods, with men, and so on like this. And the British forced a sort of, through threats in Tuscany of, if you continue this, we will send a squadron and block up Livorno and effectively decimate the economy there. So the British, in regards to Tuscany, were very, very instrumental in this. In regards to the House of Monarchy in general, it was mostly then a case of the Austrian Netherlands and these problems about smuggling, the problems about illicit trade and so on like this. And they were never quite so successful there. The Habsburgs wanted this position where they could say that they're neutral, but allow this trade to continue because it made them so much money. And they managed to succeed in that by, renewing sort of empty proclamations of merchants don't sell to the Americans, and then they don't do anything about it. So the merchants sell to the Americans regardless. And this is just kept on throughout that time. And they partly frustrated the British in Brussels because their main representative at the time of sort of American privateers turning up in Ostend was deeply unfortunate in that he shot a Belgian duke, the Duke of Arnberg, during a hunting accident, and he was effectively depressed and resigned his post not too long afterwards. But he was the man in that moment of extreme pressure to stop the ministers in the Austrian Netherlands from trading with America, and he simply couldn't do his job to the greatest extent. So the British had very sort of limited success then generally in the monarchy by simply getting empty promises and not really being able to fully stop it. And nor did they want to, because as I said, after 1780, Ostend is the only neutral port. All belligerents had firms then using Ostend, the French, the Dutch, the British, and the British especially use Ostend to continue their supplies to the Caribbean and the colonies in the Caribbean. So it proved then in the end to be actually quite useful for them as well. Yeah.
There it is. Now we have at least 3 questions that
I'll
are
be quick.
similar in nature, and I think it's a great way to wrap things up here. Everybody's fascinated in this whole new twist because they've never heard of this before. The Habsburg monarchy and the American Revolution. What got you into that? Because you are from Wales, and how long have you been researching on the book or this subject?
Great, thank you. It's a very nice question. And again, as you write, a nice ending question. I was asked this question as well by 2 ladies in the front here as we were beginning. So I explained that when I was an undergraduate, I was an exchange student at the University of Vienna. That's where I began sort of my journey on Habsburg history with some very great professors there. And I simply wondered, what occurred there during the American Revolution. American history for me had always been a great passion, probably instigated during numerous family trips to the United States as a child, particularly the colonial era. You know, if you've ever gone to Monticello or to Mount Vernon as a child, you're instantly awoken with this passion of the colonial period and a fascinating time in American history. So I simply wondered what had happened in Vienna during that time, what people in Vienna, what the Habsburgs had made of it. And I could never quite find a satisfactory answer or any definitive work, let's say, on the topic. There was a book written in the 1880s, believe it or not, also at the University of Innsbruck, by a man who later became the director of the archives in Vienna, who wrote up on this topic, but he used entirely diplomatic sources. And so after I'd read his work, I was still asking myself these sort of questions, wondering more about the ideas, wondering more about the commerce that was mentioned, you know, between the pages. And so I just set upon this journey myself to find out, and that led me to study American history as a postgraduate, and then to complete my doctorate on this topic at Edinburgh. And then I subsequently continued to expand the thesis into a book. I wanted to have a much more wholesome story, one that goes from really the 1760s to 1790s. And so I spent a good deal of time then to expand it into the volume you see now. And as I've perhaps mentioned at the beginning, the stories and the highlights I sort of presented tonight are not the full picture. There are many, many, many other names, many other individuals and fascinating examples that I just can't simply, you know, fit into any one talk. So the book will contain a lot of interest in things from a monk in Upper Austria writing plays about the American Revolution, to 3 Tuscans set adrift in a boat with just a bottle of rum heading to the North African coast, and how that had an effect with the American Revolution. The second federal court case in American history is about an Austrian topic. The Congress of Paris, the Peace of Paris, the Great Treaty of Paris that created the United States, was very nearly the Treaty of Vienna of 1781 rather than the Peace of Paris of 1783. That's also a great episode in this story, which we didn't have time for tonight. So there are many, many more issues and parts of this story as well that I wanted to include in a much more robust book. So I hope that I've inspired you all to delve more deeply into it and to not judge places that might seem distant, might seem far away, you know, at first glance, and to see them as wider possibilities, and to see places like the Habsburg monarchy as having a great role within American history. So I think that's a very good note to end on. And thank you very much again for all your attendance.
All right, well, my question mark's gone at the end of, beginning there. But thank you very much, Dr. Singerson, for being here with us tonight. And thank you all for joining us here and at home or wherever you may be. I would invite you to, if you'd like to discuss this whole topic further with Dr. Singerson, he will be in the back table. We do have copies, limited copies of his books available for purchase. So I hope your talk entice some people to go and purchase a copy. So but before we officially conclude, I would like to invite you to visit the events page on our website, www.americanrevolutioninstitute.org, where you can learn more about and register for our upcoming historical programs. Our next one is going to be this Friday. It's a lunch bite that will be held here at Anderson House at 12:30. In our original library right behind you all here. And this lunch bite will feature the Institute's Director of Education, Stacia Smith, who will be discussing the Patriots Monitor, an early American primer published in 1810. So registration is currently open for that, as well as all of our other future historical programs. So with that, on behalf of the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, I'd like to thank you all again for joining us and for your continued support of our mission. So wish you all a great evening and get home safe. Until next time, good night. Thank you.